evening, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. Can you hear quite clearly? Is that all right? All right for everybody? Okay. I'm really sorry, as I said last week, that I've got to sit up here on this awfully high stage. It's rather like being in a helicopter looking down on you, but forgive me. Also, we had a most beautiful sign last week, some of you may remember, with MYOHO RENGE KYO on it. And sadly, it's been left behind, so instead we're going to have MYOHO RENGE KYO on the board here, because that is the subject for the talk I'm going to give tonight. And as many of you may know, the chanting of MYOHO RENGE KYO is the core of our practice in Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism. So it's a very vital subject, but also it's a very difficult subject to explain, because MYOHO RENGE KYO, being virtually an unseen force, to define it absolutely clearly is a hard job. Anyway, I hope that by the time you leave the hall this evening, you'll have some idea of what MYOHO RENGE KYO really is. So, first I should explain that MYOHO RENGE KYO, without the nam, is the force of life, the dynamically creative force, which is at the same time entirely harmonious, that produces every phenomena that we see around us in the whole universe, from stars to trees to tides coming and going, to the seasons, plants, and of course human beings. So I hope that immediately makes it clear that through observing nature we can be sure that the force of life is essentially dynamic and progressive, yet at the same time it's harmonious. So nature, of course, if you look at it, has a perfect balance. It's only the interference of man that has caused nature to become imbalanced. But left to itself, the force of MYOHO RENGE KYO is the most beautiful thing one can possibly imagine. It is life. Life in all its amazing glory. The life that we see manifested in phenomena which are quite unbelievable in their variety. A myriad different varieties of phenomena arising out of the creative force of MYOHO RENGE KYO. Last week, I talked to you about the 10 worlds, or the 10 states of life: hell, hunger, anger, animality, tranquility, rapture, learning, partial enlightenment, bodhisattva, and Buddha. And from that talk, I hope you all understood that hell and heaven and the state of Buddhahood are nowhere else but in this life. This is Buddhism's strong teaching. And I think by the end of that talk, many of you had felt probably that you had experienced hell right here in this lifetime. And sometimes you had experienced the rapture of heaven. So the 10 worlds, or the 10 basic conditions of life that we revolve through every moment of the day, are really the ingredients, if you like, of this creative force of life, MYOHO RENGE KYO. So far as human beings are concerned, of course, we have the treasure, but sometimes the disadvantage of a thinking mind. And through that thinking mind, we have free will to decide which way to go, what to do, what action we can take. Not spontaneously and instinctively like an animal, but where necessary through judgment arising from deep thought. And you remember also that those 10 worlds that we studied can work either negatively and destructively or positively and creatively. So in other words, because of his thinking mind, the human being can make a choice. Though sometimes it's not possible for him to choose, but he can make a choice between basing his actions on the negative side of the 10 states of life or on the positive and creative side. We learned also that so far as those 6 lower worlds are concerned, hell, hunger, anger, animality, tranquility, and rapture, that the human being passes through those worlds without any effort on his part whatsoever. He's pushed into them through his reaction to happenings in his environment. On the other hand, to get into the 4 higher worlds of learning, partial enlightenment, bodhisattva, and Buddha, he has to make effort. So either the human being has the choice of being swayed by his environment, or if you like, at the mercy of his environment, or through effort, he can live a creative and harmonious life, using the 10 worlds in a positive sense and not a negative sense. Nam, the first word you see on that blackboard, is that effort. The effort, nam, to put himself in rhythm with MYOHO RENGE KYO, the natural and creative and harmonious force of life, or of universal life. So in other words, Nam MYOHO RENGE KYO, which is what we chant, is the power to turn every state, every one of those 10 conditions of life, into positive, creative, harmonious action in its fullest and wholest sense. Therefore, Nam MYOHO RENGE KYO is the Buddha state, the highest state of life in which a human being can live totally creatively, totally progressively, totally valuably. And yet, despite that creativity and that dynamic urge to progress, he can live harmoniously with his environment. So I think you'll agree with me, if you look at the world of today, we have the great problem, to put it in a nutshell, is that of course man wants to live dynamically and progressively. This is a natural urge in his life, but he continuously fails to live harmoniously, either with his fellow men and women or with his natural environment. Likewise, you get some thoughtful people who wish to live harmoniously, yet sadly all they succeed in creating is a sort of compromise which is weak and wishy-washy and usually collapses and fails in the end. So Nam MYOHO RENGE KYO, as I say, is essentially dynamically progressive, immensely creative, and yet at the same time totally harmonious. So Nam means to be in rhythm with the rhythm or the natural law of life in the whole universe. Nam MYOHO RENGE KYO. And I'll explain each of those words in detail as the lecture progresses. So already you can see that in contemplating MYOHO RENGE KYO, one is contemplating something simply boundless, infinite, eternal, incredibly powerful, yet incredibly beautiful. The natural law of life itself. So it was Nichiren Daishonin who was born on the 16th of February, 1222, in Japan, who declared not only that man could be in rhythm with this incredible force if he chanted MYOHO RENGE KYO, but also his understanding of exactly how that incredible force works. So the understanding of how it works is the philosophy of Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism, which is often called the philosophy of life. And the chanting of MYOHO RENGE KYO is its practice, the practice that enables you to live the philosophy. Of course, there are many philosophies in this world, many great and noble thinking. But the problem has always been that man or woman can't live it. The beauty of Nichiren Daishonin's teachings is that he not only gave an incredibly complete and all-embracing philosophy, but he gave one a practice that gives one the power to actually live it continuously, day in, day out, for the whole of one's lifetime. So Nichiren Daishonin, who, as I said, was born on the 16th of February, 1222, in fact, we're having a special gongyo at our center at Richmond on Saturday in order to commemorate that anniversary. He spent a great many years studying all the teachings of Buddhism that he could lay his hands on in Japan. As a very young boy, like many young intelligent boys, he went to the temple, his local temple, to be educated. And as a result of living in this temple, he decided to become a priest. And after being accepted into the priesthood as a teenager, he then set about his studies. Later in his life, when he was talking about his boyhood, he described to some extent how it was that he came to be enlightened. At this point, I hasten to add that he didn't set out to study the teachings of Buddhism in Japan in order to become enlightened. He became enlightened before he did that. The purpose of him setting out to study the teachings of Buddhism wherever he could lay his hands on them was in order to prove through historical, documentary or literary proof the validity of his enlightenment in the flow or history of Buddhism as a whole. He wished to relate his enlightenment, in other words, to the enlightenment of Shakyamuni Buddha 2,000 years before. And this he succeeded in doing. So his teachings contain all the necessary facts in order to establish the clear, crystal clear flow of Buddhism from the days of Shakyamuni through 2,000 years to the days when he was teaching. He said that he described it as a great jewel, he said, as brilliant as a star was in his right sleeve. In other words, Nichiren Daishonin was enlightened not through the teaching of anybody, but through the natural processes in his own life. And it's his enlightenment that enabled him to provide us today with this philosophy and practice, which, if we follow it, can enable us to live in rhythm with the law of life. So after about 16 years of study, in which he justified in historical sense, in literary sense, everything that was involved in his teachings, he returned to the same temple. And on the 28th of April, 1253, he asked the priests and the lay people of the community in which his temple was situated to come and listen to a lecture. And at that lecture, what he said simply shocked everyone to the very roots of their life. Because he said the reason why we are suffering so much today, and at that time Japan was suffering incredible natural disasters, the worst in all recorded history, earthquakes, typhoons, starvation, disease, the most incredible period of 40 years in all Japan's history from the point of view of natural disasters. And he said the reason why this country is suffering is because everybody has failed to follow the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. Because that in itself really made people sit up straight. And then he began to expound the teaching of MYOHO RENGE KYO. And he said, pointed out to them all that 2,000 years previously, Shakyamuni Buddha had clearly said that during that 2,000-year period, his original teachings would decline and in the end be of no value to people, to give them happiness in the age that would begin roughly 2,000 years after he died. Shakyamuni had said, when the period, 2,000 years after I die, begins, the world will be in a state of chaos. And he listed many of the disasters that would be occurring. And he said the only teaching which will be able to give the people happiness in that age, which he called Mappo, M-A-P-P-O, is the Lotus Sutra. And the title of the Lotus Sutra is MYOHO RENGE KYO. So Nichiren Daishonin explained this to everybody, and there was an absolute uproar when he'd finished talking. And in fact, from that time onwards, throughout the whole of his life, he was savagely persecuted. This was not surprising. It's very difficult to visualize today what the situation was then. But the fact that was that people had been following the earlier sutras of Shakyamuni for hundreds of years. Priests had vested interests in their jobs in temples. Emperors and the government followed one particular of those early teachings or another. By suddenly refuting them all, of course he brought the fury of the whole nation down on his head. Who was this upstart? This ordinary common priest who had the nerve to stand up and say, we are wrong. Nevertheless, he lived his whole life naturally. And during the course of it, firmly established these teachings and the practice which we are doing today. So I'd like now just very briefly to talk about the Lotus Sutra, back to which Shakyamuni, Nichiren Daishonin, traced his own teaching. So the Lotus Sutra was taught by Shakyamuni Buddha in the last 8 years of his life. At that time he'd been teaching for more than 40 years. And he reached the point where he said, this is my supreme teaching. If you're going to understand this teaching, you must discard all my previous teachings, which are only partial or provisional. But equally, he said, the fact is that only few will understand the Lotus Sutra in my day. But 2,000 years later, the people will have the intellectual capacity to be able to understand it and live its teaching. So the Lotus Sutra, of course, when it was originally taught by Shakyamuni Buddha 3,000 years ago, was recorded in Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, and my Sanskrit pronunciation is not very perfect, it is Sadama Pundarika Sutra. Sadama Pundarika Sutra. But gradually, as the centuries passed after Shakyamuni died, this teaching traveled from India into China, and it was translated into what is now the ancient Chinese language by a great scholar and translator called Kumarajiva. And its name in Chinese is, and my Chinese isn't very good either, is Myo and Ho. How's that? Anyone from Myo and Ho. So you may say, well, how on earth do we get this MYOHO RENGE KYO? And to understand that, it's necessary to realize that Chinese characters were imported into Japan by the Japanese, because they're perhaps the most amazingly economical way of expressing an enormous amount. One character of the ancient Chinese language can supply you with enough to write a book on. So the Japanese were very wise to adopt these characters. But of course, they had a different language. So therefore, MYOHO RENGE KYO is the meaning of those Chinese characters expressed, or rather the sound of those Chinese characters expressed in Japanese phonetics. Impossible to understand, isn't it? So MYOHO RENGE KYO is the phonetics in Japanese of the ancient Chinese characters, which in turn were a translation of the original Sanskrit. So in other words, it's just as difficult for a Japanese person to understand the meaning when he looks at those characters, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, as it is for us or for a German or anybody else. So in that sense, everybody universally or internationally who practices Nam Myoho Renge Kyo starts at square one with no advantage. And even the Chinese person who looks at those characters, though they may be able to pronounce the sound Myo Fa Lien Hua Qing, can't for the life of them understand the depths of the meaning, because these characters are ancient and no longer in general use. So the meaning of MYOHO RENGE KYO, literally, could be translated as the wonderful law of the lotus, or the teaching of the perfect law of the lotus flower, however you like to look at it. That is its literal meaning. But as you already must be realizing, MYOHO RENGE KYO, in fact, not only is the title of the sutra, but it's also the very essence of what the Lotus Sutra teaches. Those characters, MYOHO RENGE KYO, in fact, describe the mechanics and the ingredients and the working of the law of life, the natural law or rhythm of life. So although this is very complicated to explain, it has a great practical advantage from the point of view of practice, because it means that on what we call our object of devotion, or Gohonzon, we can put the whole essence of all Buddhist teachings on a small scroll, and in those characters, in fact, everything is contained. So Shakyamuni Buddha, when he taught the Lotus Sutra, said, this sutra contains the essence of all I've taught over all the 42 years of my teaching. And this was further explained and defined down to 2 main chapters of the 28 chapters of the Lotus Sutra. And those 2 main chapters, which we recite in our daily practice, called the Hobenpon and the Juryohon, contain the essence of the whole of the Lotus Sutra. And Nichiren Daishonin then pointed out that in the normal, customary way with all Buddhist teachings, the title of the sutra itself contained the essence of everything. And that was MYOHO RENGE KYO. So perhaps that's understandable when you think that if someone says to you, England will convey that one word, everything that you can think of about England, won't it? The people, the towns, the cities, the weather, the problems, inflation. Every single aspect of England is contained in that one word. MYOHO RENGE KYO, similarly, contains everything. The only difference is that we haven't ever understood MYOHO RENGE KYO, whereas we have grown up to understand England. So the purpose of the Buddhist teachings is to enable us to understand MYOHO RENGE KYO and prove it in our daily lives. So in the Gosho, which are the writings of Nichiren Daishonin, he wrote this in a famous Gosho called On Attaining Buddhahood. MYOHO RENGE KYO, this truth is MYOHO RENGE KYO. Chanting MYOHO RENGE KYO will therefore enable you to grasp the mystic truth within you. MYOHO RENGE KYO is the king of the sutras, flawless in both letter and principles. Its words are the reality of life, and the reality of life is the mystic law, MYOHO. And he prefaced that by saying, if you wish to free yourself from the sufferings of birth and death, which you have endured through eternity, and attain supreme enlightenment in this lifetime, you must awaken to the mystic truth which has always been within your life. This truth is MYOHO RENGE KYO. In other words, the truth of life is expressed in the words or characters MYOHO RENGE KYO. And MYOHO RENGE KYO exists in us and in the whole universe. But unfortunately, we've never understood that. So now I'd like to take each word and try my best to explain what they mean. And I don't want to start with Nam. I'll come back to that last of all. First, I want to take MYOHO. So MYOHO, as it says in that excerpt from the Gosho, means the mystic law. Mystic meaning something that is difficult to understand. Sometimes we mistake mystic for magic. That's not the true meaning of mystic. Mystic is something awkward or difficult to understand. And the words MYOHO, which mean mystic law, can be translated, the characters that is to say, can be translated in many different ways. They can mean darkness and light. Myo, darkness, Ho, light. Myo is also mystic, difficult to understand. Ho is law. It can also mean Myo, unseen, Ho, seen. Also it can mean Myo, latent, Ho, manifest. So even with those various definitions of the word MYOHO, you may be getting to get a picture of what it is these words are trying to describe. Something that can be both unseen and seen. Something that can be both dark and yet also light. Something that can be latent and also manifest or active. MYOHO. mystic, Myo, Ho, law. Dark, light, seen, unseen, latent, manifest. So Nichiren Daishonin went on to point out that if you really look at life, this is what you find that it's like. If we look at the surface of life, we only see the phenomena around us. If we look at ourselves, or I look at you, on the surface I see your shape, your body, and the clothes you're wearing. But in everything there's something else, isn't there? What can be termed the spiritual side of life or the unseen side of life. We know there is an unseen part of life. All we can see is the seen part. But we know there is an unseen because we see it in action so often. We know that we can produce anger. We know that when we are angry, we have a red face and staring eyes. But where does anger come from? And where does it go to? We can be angry for a moment, and yet we can be happy the next moment. Where has anger gone? It hasn't left our lives, because something else can happen and we can be angry again. Anger, in other words, is latent in our lives, unseen, yet when something triggers it off in the environment, very much seen. And all the other emotions we can think of are the same, aren't they? Joy, sadness, all existing in one's life, latent, until something draws it out. So the red face and the staring eyes are nothing really. They're the tip of the iceberg, aren't they? What is really something is anger itself. That unseen force which expresses itself in red face, staring eyes, and angry words. So this is MYOHO. Anger which can be unseen and yet seen. MYOHO can also be life and death. Myo, death, Ho, life. Life we can see, Ho, all around us. But how is it that life, or that manifestation of life can actually appear? Where does it come from? You may say, well, in our case, we're born in our mother's womb, and there are all sorts of complicated things like genes and all the rest of it, which do it. But this isn't so, is it? Even the genes are a manifestation of life. What about the force that created it? What about the force that creates a typhoon? What about the force that makes thunder? This is Myo, the unseen, incredibly powerful force of life. The force that can create such a myriad different manifestations of itself. So MYOHO, life and death, is a very significant point, because Buddhism points out that this is the rhythm of life. That life itself, in all its various manifestations, is going through the movement of MYOHO, from latency to manifest and back to latency again, and then manifest again. Buddhism points out that this is one of the great rhythms of life, that everything is going through a cycle of MYOHO, manifest and latent, and manifest again, and latent again. And as I explained last week, Buddhism also points out that this rhythm of life and death, Myo and Ho, is vital. Because only through the state of death, which has such a horrible ring to our ears, Yet in fact, it's only through the state of death or latency that an entity of life, which may be ourselves or a beetle or whatever, can regenerate sufficient energy to take on another life, another seen form. Therefore, the rhythm of Myo and Ho, life and death, is vital. As much as it's vital for us to sleep in order to sustain and maintain the physical form that we have now. So like all physical things, they must decay. This is in the very nature of anything physical or material. But the life entity, or the life, if you like, that exists in it, is indestructible. You can shoot someone through the heart or the head, but you can't destroy that person's actual life. You can destroy his physical self, the manifestation of life, but not life itself. This is only common sense, isn't it? So Myo and Ho are one part of the explanation of life and death. And I hope that that now has some meaning to you. Now let's go on to Renge. Renge literally means lotus flower. That's why the teaching in its original form by Shakyamuni Buddha was called the wonderful law of the lotus. The lotus flower produces its flower and its seed at the identical same time. And I think I'm right in saying that it's the only plant or flower that does such a thing. Normally, of course, the seed follows the flower. And this represents the simultaneity of cause and effect. So this is the second aspect of this incredible law of life, the law of cause and effect. The law which makes it clear that whatever you do, whatever action you make every minute and second of the day will have an effect which will manifest itself in your life at some time when the time and conditions and circumstances are right. So you can think of times, perhaps even, where you've made a cause and the effect has been absolutely immediate. If you are really angry with someone and hurl insulting words at him, the effect may be very, very quick, mightn't it? He may come at you and try to take a swipe at you, or he may hurl even more insulting words back at you. Cause and effect there is almost instantaneous. But that's not always so. Even if you take that same sort of stupid example, you could get a case where you hurl insulting words at someone, and that person does nothing at that moment. He may go away smouldering and upset and revengeful, and 5 years later, when you meet him as you walk round a corner, everything comes back to him and he takes a swipe back at you. The point of that stupid story is that the effect was immediately built into his life, the person who was insulted, and also in the life of the person who called out those insulting words. And it appeared when the time and the circumstances were right. So of course scientists know about cause and effect. All their analyses and their research is based on an understanding of cause and effect. But what scientists don't entirely understand, and I hope no scientist is going to hurl insulting words at me now, is that if the effect is instantaneous. So what Buddhism teaches is that there is a latent cause which produces an external cause, which creates an inherent or latent effect, and then a manifest effect. The most important point being that the two are entirely instantaneous. The moment you do something, the moment you say rude words to somebody, the effect is in your life immediately and in the life of the other person. So what Buddhism is pointing out is that the motivation for our lives is founded on this cause and effect. What Nichiren Daishonin pointed out was that if you want to understand what happened to you in the past, look at what's happening in your life now. Because what is happening in your life now is the effects of the causes you made yesterday, the day before, last year, 40 years ago, and even in a previous life. And if you want to know what your future is going to be like, the Buddha said, look at the causes that you're making now, and the causes you make tomorrow and the next day and so on. So this law of cause and effect is very strict. You made the causes. Therefore, the only way to change your circumstances is to recognize this and start making great causes. The tragedy with this world is that everyone's hitting out and blaming everyone else, aren't they? Wherever you go. This is why there's no harmony, why there are wars, why there's violence, why there's greed, competitiveness. Because everyone is blaming everybody else for what they're suffering from. But in fact, it's us, no one else. We made the causes to suffer as we're suffering maybe at this moment. And the more you think about this, the more this thing really lives. And the more you actually see it working in your life. You may do something tomorrow, and the next day you may get the effect. You can prove it all over the place. So the law of cause and effect is strict. It's the law of life. It's as much of a law of life as the law of gravity, which is part of the law of life. We know gravity exists. We don't know how it works exactly. And we certainly can't see it except in its manifestation. But we know that law's there. And the more one's eyes and mind become open to the law of cause and effect, the more clearly it exists, and you can't escape the fact. And it's no good complaining about it, because it's there. Therefore, the best thing is to recognize it and start to harmonize one's life with it by, as I say, making great causes. And fortunately, the power of the Buddhist practice gives one the strength to sustain such a difficult course, to make great causes. So in a way, I always feel that MYOHO, the cycle of life and death, and the law of cause and effect which runs through it is just like the warp and weft of a cloth. This is the rhythm or the pattern of life. Finally, we've got kyo. So kyo, translated literally, means, again, a number of different things. It can mean teaching, or sutra, or communication, or vibration, or sound. But whatever happens, everything to do with kyo is sound. I'm communicating something to you through sound. Everything that we do every day which relates to something else in our environment is related through sound. So sound is the link that exists between all the myriad manifestations of MYOHO RENGE, the law of life. Not only do we communicate by sound, but also porpoises and dolphins do under the sea by making bleeping noises. There are sounds that we can't even hear. Even mankind has invented whistles that will call a certain bird or insect or animal which you can't hear with your normal hearing. So sound is an incredible thing. Wavelengths on the radio are conveying sound. Sound which ripples out from me or you out into the boundless universe. Nothing actually can stop sound. Sound can penetrate these walls, can't it? The waves of sound go on, as it were, forever. And since we communicate everything we do, every pulse and vibration of our life by sound, we can see that that connection that we have with everything around us has no limit, has no boundary. We don't know what happens to sound waves when they go beyond the distance that man can penetrate. But Buddhism says they're going out and out and out. Of course, they're also going in and in to us. So Kyo is the life link, the link which binds every living thing together, that binds a man with an insect or with a tree, a plant, everything that you can think about. So Kyo is the foundation of a great Buddhist principle called Eshofuni. Eshofuni, the oneness of man with his environment. Everything that we do is affecting our environment. And our environment is reacting to that effect. And we are then reacting to that. So the whole of life is like a series of acting and reacting sounds or waves. So Kyo is vitally important to understand. The link of life that connects not only us all in this room tonight, but with everything and everybody. One action leads to a reaction, which leads to a further reaction. You may go out of this room, back home, or perhaps into a pub, and you may discuss a little bit about what we've talked about tonight. Someone overhears it, or through that discussion you understand more. You then talk more to somebody else, or that person who heard may talk to someone else, or he may say nonsense. And the crying nonsense will have its effect on everybody around him. This again is sort of mind-boggling. But these actions and reactions, these interactions, flow outwards, as I said last week, like dropping a pebble in a pond and seeing the ripples going out until it reaches the very edge. But we don't know where the edge of the universe is. As far as we know, it's boundless. So the ripples go on and on and on. Everything that we do is affecting not just our environment around us here, but the whole universe. Everything that we do, though this is difficult to believe, is therefore affecting not only other people, but things that grow, the weather, the behavior of the climate. This is why Nichiren Daishonin said in Japan, the reason why we're suffering now is because the whole of Japan is basing their lives on what is in fact a negative and wrong philosophy. And the effect goes outwards into everything. So I don't expect you to take that in or begin to believe it in one. But the more you think about it, the more you observe, the more you ponder over things like pollution and destruction of the environment, the more you realize this is true. What is the difference between a wise farmer and a stupid farmer? Everything that he does, in the wise man's case, will produce good results. Richness of soil and of plants and fruit and vegetables. The stupid farmer, who has no wisdom and sows his seeds not at quite the right moment, who fails to put in the fertilizer on quite the right day, who fails to prune his trees at quite the right time of year, will produce a result which is less rich, according to the degree of his stupidity. We may say it was bad luck, but Buddhism wouldn't say that. Buddhism would say it's cause and effect. If a man makes wise causes, then they reap rich effects. So lastly, I want to come back to Nam, and what I said at the very beginning, which is that Nam is the effort to put yourself in rhythm or in harmony with the law of life itself. Nam, Namu, is from the Sanskrit word namas. And it means devotion. When the Japanese language is spoken, many words have an u or an a on the end of it, but it's not sounded in normal conversation. So we don't say namu. In fact, we say nam. And this word means not just devotion in a literal, shallow sense, but the devotion of your whole life, body and spirit, seen and unseen, every part of you, devoting itself, in other words, making great effort to be in harmony with the rhythm, the natural rhythm or law of life. Nam MYOHO RENGE KYO. So that, I think, is quite clear, this word Nam, the effort. So in the Buddhist practice, twice a day, and if you wish more than that, that's up to you and your life state and desires and wishes at any given moment, you take the trouble to spare a little time to struggle to make effort to put your own life in rhythm with the law of natural life itself, or universal life, by following the teachings of the Buddha. And those teachings are to chant Nam MYOHO RENGE KYO, and also to recite those certain vital chapters of the sutra, and to express your determination to continue to make effort, day in, day out, to keep yourself on the railway line. So it's, of course, very mystic. It's very difficult to believe that just by chanting those few words you can achieve such an incredible result. But the fact is that you do. I don't think anyone would continue to practice unless they got the actual proof that they were on the railway line. It's true, too, that those who sometimes may stop practicing really can see that they're off the track and bumping along over the sleepers. So, of course, the only reason why anyone can continue to do this practice, which whilst it's not really difficult, is difficult enough to require effort. The only reason why people go on is because they see the actual proof of the benefit to their lives beyond a shadow of doubt. So day in, day out, I've done it now for 10 years. Others of you here in the hall tonight have done it for a long time too. Never in the world would you have kept going without seeing the result. But incredibly enough, when you first start to chant, you wonder what on earth you're doing, sitting in your room or kneeling in your room, saying these extraordinary words which you don't really understand at all. The fact is that if you keep going for a month or two, even if you keep going for 1 week or 4 days in some cases, or 3 days or 2 days, you see the result. Perhaps at first you don't believe it. And you say, oh, this is just coincidence. But something has touched your life. Deep in your life, something sort of feels this extraordinary thing is important. And you decide to go on. Or perhaps your friend who you trust says, please keep going a bit longer. And for one reason or another you do, and you get the proof. There isn't one person that I've ever heard of who chanted MYOHO RENGE KYO for as long as 3 months who didn't get absolute, clear, actual proof that what this man Nichiren Daishonin was teaching is absolutely valid and true. So this is so incredible, but it gives me so much joy to be able to say that with absolute, total conviction. So just to round this explanation off, I think it will become clear that the whole purpose of this practice of chanting MYOHO RENGE KYO, to keep yourself in rhythm, is to make great causes, good causes, valuable causes, to make sure that you don't revert to making bad causes, miserable causes. Of course it doesn't happen overnight. Of course you've got to really discover yourself in order to overcome those weak points in your life, in your karma, which have made you make bad causes, miserable causes, time and time and time again. But through the practice, you more and more see this. And the desire to make great causes becomes stronger and stronger in you. So this is why Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism is called true Buddhism. There is a principle in Buddhism called Honin Myo. You don't need to worry too much about it. But Honin Myo means the principle of the true cause. And there's another matching principle on the other side of the coin, which is called Hongamyo. Hongamyo is the principle of the true effect. So what Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism is saying is that the most important thing is to make these good, great causes and to base your life on that. Though you have a karma now, though it manifests itself in this way at this particular moment, what is going to reshape it is the causes you make from now on. You can't do anything about what you see your life is at this very moment, because the causes were made long ago or yesterday, and you can't undo them. Therefore, it's no good being guilty and feeling miserable and moaning and groaning about one's lot, because nothing is going to change those causes that you made before. The best thing you can do, says Buddhism, is to make great causes now and tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And if you follow this practice, you'll have the power to do it. So Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism is the Buddhism of the true cause. Honin-myo. It's also the Buddhism which is for this age called Mappo by Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni said that this teaching could be understood and practiced by people in this age, starting round about the year 900 or 1000 AD, that is to say 2000 years roughly after Shakyamuni died. Hongamyo, the true effect, is something we should try to fight to avoid. But in fact, when you think about the meaning of Hongamyo, you'll realize that you may have been living a life based on that principle of the true effect for years. The principle of the true effect, Hongamyo, manifests itself every time you say, well, he can do it, but I don't think I can. It's all right for him, but I know me, it's not possible for me. He can pass that exam, but I don't think I've got a chance. I want a house like that, but there's not a hope I can ever get it. I'd like to be like so-and-so. I think he's a really creative person, but there doesn't seem to be anything creative in me. That is Hongamyo, living a life based on the principle of the true effect. So the whole of this practice, the whole of this teaching is founded on the true cause. Guilt is impossible if you practice Buddhism, even though you may still feel guilty at the beginning. And it's so ingrained in us Westerners through the philosophies and traditions of religion that we've been brought up into, that it takes sometimes a long time to iron it out. But in the end, through this practice, one rids oneself of it, the sooner or the later. Guilt is pointless. Guilt is not only pointless but destructive. It saps one's life, saps one's energy, saps one's will to do great things. Guilt is disgusting and horrible. Guilt is really one of the great problems in this world. So, living the principle of the true cause brings about a fantastic change in one's life. Not only does the chanting and the practice change you, because it brings benefit, but the fact that you are no longer living that miserable Hongamyo existence, the fact that you can turn everything into positive, and that sufferings or difficulties or problems, however difficult and complex they may seem, you realize the more you go on practicing them that you can overcome them. The spirit of Hongamyo gradually disappears from one. So this is why you may read sometimes, this is called true Buddhism. This isn't denigrating Shakyamuni Buddha, as some people seem to feel or think. This is a description of the Buddhism that we are practicing. So in other words, going back to what I said earlier on, Nichiren Daishonin was enlightened to this law of life in his earliest days, when he said, to quote again, "A great jewel as brilliant as a star was in my right sleeve." He was the person who had the task of first discovering this. There's nothing unusual in that. Newton was the first person who discovered the law of gravity. The law of gravity had always existed, hadn't it? But Newton, with his seeking mind, naturally, just by watching an apple fall off a tree, realized the law of gravity. Nichiren Daishonin, as a young man, through his seeking mind and the enlightened nature of his life, realized the law of MYOHO RENGE KYO. His purpose, his task in life, was to be the first one. So Shakyamuni Buddha in the Lotus Sutra only explained his experience of enlightenment. He gave clues and hints, but Shakyamuni Buddha couldn't teach us how we could become enlightened ourselves. This was not anything to do with Shakyamuni's ability or the nature of his enlightenment. Shakyamuni totally understood MYOHO RENGE KYO, but it wasn't the age or the time when people could possibly have practiced it. But Nichiren Daishonin was born in the age of Mappo, just exactly as Shakyamuni had predicted. And he was able to teach us in such a way that we can follow his practice today. So we chant sitting up straight, with our eyes open, and of course, once we've understood and got proof we wish to receive a Gohonzon, which is the subject of the lecture next week, the actual object of devotion, and we chant MYOHO RENGE KYO, and as we say these words, we express our desires and wishes. And Nichiren Daishonin said, when you chant MYOHO RENGE KYO, it's important to have a single mind. In the Gosho teachings, he said, anybody with two minds never achieves anything remarkable. We chant with a single mind, confident in the fact that because MYOHO RENGE KYO is the law of the universe, the force of life itself, it can only work for creatively, valuably, and harmoniously. In other words, if what we are chanting for is not right for our happiness, we'll quite soon, we'll quite soon discover that for ourselves absolutely clearly and to our full satisfaction. So Nichiren Daishonin said, chant with a single mind, and you can achieve results which, compared to previously, are boundless. The power of MYOHO RENGE KYO can only work valuably for one's happiness, never invaluably. Even if one chanted for something which was positively wicked, in no time at all, in some way or other, with one's whole life, one will be made to realize that. In other words, it would rebound on you. So I often tell, to illustrate that, the story of a young American who was my first leader in Japan. And he was a drug addict, and he started to chant. And actually, he'd already been told by the doctors that if he continued in the way he was doing, he was going to die within that year. And he tried to get help. He was wandering on the beach in San Francisco, and he met a girl in the street, and he said, "Can you give me a roof?" And the girl said, "On one condition." And he said, "What's that?" And she said, "That you chant MYOHO RENGE KYO." So he was furious at this, but he wanted that shelter, and he was already very ill. And he sat in front of her Gohonzon and ridiculed it. And then, because he wanted to stay there, and the roof was more important than anything else, he told her he would chant. But with his tongue in his cheek, he chanted for more drugs. And 2 days later, there was a knock on the door, and the chap said, "Take this suitcase quick, the police are after me." And the suitcase was full of drugs. And he went through the whole lot in the following month and became most desperately ill, just as the doctor said he would. And he knew that he was going to die. And for the first time then, through the strongest possible desire in him not to die, the fear of death, he began to chant seriously. And this young man, who's now a good deal older, not very old still, but he's one of the great people
in Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism in America. I always tell that story because it's a perfect example of it. This is where the Gohonzon works. MYOHO RENGE KYO can only work for happiness, for creativity, and for harmony, in no other way. And of course, through practicing, you can prove that very strongly for yourself. So I hope that lecture's given you some idea of what MYOHO RENGE KYO is, and that though it's impossible to define it exactly, that when you perhaps try to chant at the suggestion of your friend, at least you'll have some feeling of the incredible depth and height and length and width of what you're doing. Thank you very much indeed. Many thanks. Good. Thank you. It's really almost time, but there's probably time for one question, if anyone wants to ask one. Has anyone got a burning question that you're just exploding to ask? If you haven't, don't worry. Yes? Yes, but those bad effects are not necessarily related to what you're chanting for, are they? Did you all hear the question? What happens when someone is chanting for something and instead they seem to get bad effects in their lives? So it's sometimes true that on the surface of your life, when you start to practice, there are certain objects floating around, covered in cobwebs and spiders and all sorts of things, which are preventing you from being happy. So sometimes when you begin to chant, a few things happen in your life which seem on the surface to be a bit upsetting. But actually, of course this doesn't always happen, but actually, strangely enough, even though this happens, something deep in your life doesn't make you particularly alarmed about it. Most cases. It's as if you're disturbing or shaking your life. So there is nothing whatsoever to fear about that. Those things are being shaken and coming to the surface so that they can be got rid of for good. And it doesn't last very long anyway, and anyway, there are never things that need cause you much disturbance. So some people say it's like the most common example is to say it's like if you've left a garden hose lying in the garden all through the winter. When you pick it up to use it in the summer, it's bound to have got some rust in it and a few cobwebs and spiders and those little wood lice and those various things that crawl down it during that winter period. Probably some mud stuck over the end of it, or a rotten old brown leaf just up the spout. So when you turn on the tap, at first you don't see any clear water coming out of it at all. Just for a few moments, spiders and a few wood lice, old leaves, mud, come out the end of it. But in a very short time, there's beautiful clear water flowing. That's a very good example of it. These few oddments are these wood lice and spiders and a bit of dust are the things that are causing you at this very moment unhappiness. So you have to rid yourself of it in order to really appreciate your life. It's the beginnings, in other words, of changing your karma, because that is in the end what the practice is for, that you can rid yourself of the obstacles to your happiness and become free and live a joyful, valuable life. Okay? You mean because you're chanting? The question's a good one. What happens if someone gets angry with you when you're chanting? So of course, sometimes this can happen. Sometimes you can find that your wife or your husband or your roommate really object. But in my experience, though this may happen, the only reason for it happening is that perhaps, not always, but perhaps you don't explain enough of what you're doing. The thing is, it's rather a strange thing to do. So sometimes people are terribly shy and self-conscious about it. And they wrap it all up in sort of darkness. And they go up to their rooms and close the door and whisper. And, you know, mothers and husbands and things wonder what on earth they're up to in there. It's like some awful black magic that they're really ashamed of. So often, really, this is the cause of opposition. But not always, of course. Sometimes, if one's karma is such, you may get strong opposition for other reasons. But my own belief is, and what the Gosho teaches is, that if you pursue that practice, doing your best not to interfere with other people's lives in the process, in the end they'll respect your sincerity. Nichiren Daishonin in one Gosho said, if you weaken your practice because your father criticizes you, you will weaken his respect for Buddhism. So the most important thing is to keep practicing, but at the same time to use good sense, not interfere with other people's lives. If one's wife or husband strongly objects, say to them, well, I don't intend to give up, but I'll try to do it, you know, when you're out at the shops or when you've gone to sleep or whatever. And in the end, because of your sincerity, and most of all because they see the change in you, they'll come to respect the practice. Okay? Great. Well, it's just after 9, or just on 9, I think now. So perhaps we'd better stop. Thank you very much indeed. Many thanks.